This is the war in Russia through the eyes of Otto Carius, one of Germany's most distinguished tank commanders. Nazi Germany nearing its end. Let's begin. We encountered chaos everywhere. The roads were completely clogged, and the vehicles were easy prey for the enemy aircraft that completely dominated the skies. By means of handouts, the civilian population was requested by our leadership to abandon its domiciles and pull back with the troops. Only a small percentage followed this request. We had a hunch that our army intended to employ tabun, a new gas that promptly incapacitated the nervous system. The High Command had probably distanced itself from using it because our own civilian population would have been wiped out, and even this weapon would not have turned the tide of the war. The majority of the civilians remained home and awaited the Americans. Of course, only a few of them believed in the silly fairy tale about the liberators, which had long since been refuted by the bombed-out ruins. But all desired the inevitable end to the dangers and the fears. After all, there were no Russians to be feared in the West, from whom the poor people in the eastern districts were fleeing in panicky fear in snow and ice. On the go around the clock, continuously hounded by fighters and bombers, that's how we reached Siegen. Although we hid the assault guns in barns or under straw during the day, another two were rendered combat ineffective by fighters and had to be blown up. How I envied those comrades who didn't have to experience this hopeless struggle during the last few weeks on the Western Front. In Siegen, I found a magnificent position on the high ground where the military posts were. From there we had great fields of fire through a cut in the woods onto the road that led into the valley on the far side of the Sieg River. We waited for the Americans at this location, but we weren't granted any kills here either, even though I had remained in my assault gun to prevent a new failure. That was because the Yanks had Confederates among us. The civilians who had nestled into the dugouts on the opposite slope stopped the American vehicles before they came into our line of sight. I still wonder even today whether such a thing could be possible in another nation. I then withdrew my company toward Weidenau and covered the tank obstacle there. I set up my command post in the air raid bunker of a factory. I discovered from a civilian that a portion of the civilian population was cooperating with the enemy, the other portion with us. I didn't have any problem understanding that the people there were apathetic and tired of war, but that they would betray their own countrymen to the enemy. I didn't want to believe at first. In the beginning, we had also let the people run to the Yanks if they wanted to fetch some things. We didn't check anyone who came back. I soon noticed, however, that the Americans always fired wherever one of my assault guns was located, even though they couldn't see the targets at all. From that point on, we naturally sealed off the main battle line. Practically all of our Kubels were disabled. We therefore decided one evening to fetch replacements from the Americans. No one should think that that was a heroic deed. The Yanks slept in the houses at night, as was proper for combat soldiers. Who was going to disturb them anyway? At the most, one sentry was located outside, but only if there was good weather. The war started in the evenings only whenever our troops pulled back and they followed. If, by chance, a German machine gun actually fired, then the Air Force was requested as backup, but not until the next day. Around midnight, we departed with 4 men and returned after not too long a time with 2 jeeps. It was convenient that we didn't need any keys for them. Only a small latch needed to be switched and the vehicles were ready to start. Long after we had reached our lines again, the Yanks began to fire wildly in the air, probably to settle their nerves. If a night had been long enough, we could have easily driven to Paris. A small attack was planned for the next day, just east of Weidenau. It had the objective of taking high ground from which the enemy had too good a view into our positions. Infantry was not attached to me, although foot soldiers were lying about in great quantities. What could we have done with men whose fighting morale had been totally extinguished? The enemy propaganda had worked with great success. Besides, there was something else. These units had been stationed in France for a long time, and the fear of this enemy and of being taken prisoner was, compared to the East, very minimal. Everyone thought that it only mattered to just appear to go the distance. Later, as we were pressed tighter and tighter into the pocket, we encountered hordes of former German soldiers who, according to their papers, had been properly discharged from the Wehrmacht. A quite clever city commandant had thought that the Americans would fall for such a trick. For the time being, however, the enemy snapped up all civilians, all the way from the junior in high school to grandpa. They assumed that there was a criminal behind every German. In reality, the hate directed against Germany was much more virulent than anything that our propaganda had ever formulated. Even the current atrocity stories can't alter that fact. We assembled for our small operation with 4 assault guns. Even though I could barely count on success, I intended to show the Yanks that in any case, there was still a war on. The only evidence of that was in the ruins, of which they were perhaps still proud. We were used to an opponent the stature of the Russians. We were amazed at the contrast. During the entire war, I never saw soldiers disperse so head over heels even though virtually nothing was happening. After all, what could we achieve by ourselves? We advanced a few hundred meters to the south and reached our objective. I finally recognized one enemy tank, which drove wildly behind a house and disappeared. For once, I wanted to try out our 128mm cannon. I took a chance and fired at the house with a delayed fuse. The result showed us the monstrous penetrating capability of our cannon. After the second round, the American tank went up in flames, but what benefit were the best weapons in this phase of the war? The Yanks now came to life, of course, because someone was really shooting at them. We were soon in the middle of heavy artillery fire, and the bombers appeared to punish us. Fortunately, there were no casualties. At the onset of darkness, we withdrew back to our old lines because no infantry had shown up to occupy the new line. One of my assault guns became disabled when it landed in a bomb crater. The next day, the order arrived to withdraw the assault guns somewhat to the north and establish them in a better position to cover the road. Toward midnight, I had my company move out and followed later in my cubel. Just as I wanted to pass the column, a terrible blast shook the air. Everything came to a halt, and I saw that an assault gun was burning. The crews ran into the countryside because they assumed that Americans could have infiltrated. I immediately had my doubts. Americans at night against tanks? And on foot? No, that was out of the question. Everyone was under cover, weapons at the ready. Figures then surfaced, and I recognized German helmets, among them some from the First World War. These hardy souls made their way forward carefully until I broke the spell and called out to them in German. It turned out that we had the last reserves in front of us, the Volkssturm. The men had never seen a German assault gun before, of course, and were firmly convinced that they had the bad guys in front of them. One of them finally got some nerve and fired a Panzerfaust. Both sides had gotten off easy. Finally, General Feldmarschall Model made me happy with the order to transport my hunting tigers to Unna. I had been complaining about insufficient fields of fire. I hoped to find that in the open plain between Unna and Wörl. We were still in the process of loading in Gummersbach when the Americans broke through at Weidenau. It was very difficult for us to get away. The rail lines were interdicted by the fighter bombers on an hourly basis, and the train personnel refused to take responsibility for the trip. Our men thus had to man the locomotives themselves. Using a small shunting engine, an advance force rode the rails to check them for their completeness. The condition of the rail bed could change hourly. The Russians would never have given us so much time. But look at how long it took the Americans to liquidate a pocket where one can scarcely talk about any kind of serious resistance. A well-equipped force of German soldiers would have easily eliminated the entire Ruhr pocket in a week at the outside. I moved quickly with the reconnaissance platoon to Unna to check out the area and the operational possibilities. Unfortunately, there wasn't too much left of the good fields of fire that I had hoped to find there. Advancing from the east, the enemy had already taken Wörl. I was attached to the city commandant in Unna. Even the unit commanders were supposed to subordinate themselves to his directives. In reality, however, they scarcely took notice of this man who acted as if he were a great field commander. In any case, I had to report to him. The command post was in the military reservation west of State Highway 233 and south of the Ruhr Highway. I finally found the entrance to the bunker. 30 steps led down into a deep cellar, which had probably been set up as an air raid shelter earlier. Above ground was a wet-behind-the-ears sentry who took his duties very seriously. At first, he didn't want to give out any information. He finally confirmed, however, that the main headquarters was there. Downstairs, I had to go through a dark passageway where a sentry led me to the boss. When the door was opened, I couldn't believe my eyes. Sitting around a huge table covered with maps were numerous SS officers in magnificent uniforms, stylish and clean. A liqueur glass was in front of each of the gentlemen. In short, a unique type of command post. I reported and gave my combat strength. With the intonation of a practiced master of ceremonies, the commandant explained the situation to me. He showed me on the map where his positions around Unna were supposedly occupied, how many men were under his command, how magnificently Unna was fortified, and how impregnable it was. Of course, my 7 hunting tigers were also placed on the map immediately. I really didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. From the positions that were given to me, I could neither fire a shot nor see 50 meters since they were located behind a railroad embankment. I had already driven around the area and sought out my position. With regard to my objections, the man in charge said jovially, "My dear friend, I think you'll find your way around soon enough. For the time being, the danger of an attack is most threatening from the east and the northeast. We'll show the Americans soon enough." I respectfully said "Jawohl," and made my way to get to some fresh air. When I opened the door, the young sentry came running in all excited and made the following report: impacting artillery in map sector XY. Outside, I asked the guard about his duties. According to him, he had to report the position of every impacting enemy round or bomb immediately. The Führer never came upstairs, not even to go to the bathroom. Everything was conducted in a comfortable manner from the telephone. What a difference from the SS units that we had seen in the East. At that point, at least, I knew that we could run the war there as we saw fit. I just had to make sure that our strange bird didn't fly out of his nest without me noticing it. I set up 2 assault guns to cover the Ruhr highway and put the remaining ones on the northern outskirts of Unna, facing Kamen. My command post was in the living room of a house near the second group. There were hardly any civilians to be seen in the city anymore. In the house that we had occupied, there was still a little old lady who took good care of us. I was almost always on the go to check out the situation so that we didn't unexpectedly fall into a trap. The next day, enemy tanks were already firing into the town, although from a very great distance. I drove from my command post to the military post to check out the mood of Fortress Headquarters Unna. The frustrated Napoleon immediately called out to me, "Unheard of impudence by these Yanks. They are simply shooting into the city with their tanks." My observation post in the flak tower reports to me that those guys have moved up onto open ground in rows with their tanks. He also recommended that I climb up the flak tower once and take a peek at their cards. He himself was impeded from climbing stairs by bone fractures and moved about with a walking stick. The Yank tanks actually did interest me, and I climbed up the flak tower. From there, I immediately saw approximately 20 enemy tanks set up in a neat little row about 2.5 kilometers away. Now and then, they fired a salvo into the city. I thought to myself that we really ought to show these guys for once that we too had a few rounds of ammunition left. If they had already come over the big pond and had to be subjected to so much unnecessary fear, then they ought to be able to at least talk about one live round after their return home. That's the type of mean people we Germans are. I wanted our Napoleon to have a part in our operation, however. The bone fractures wouldn't bother him in my tank, after all. I thus went back to the command post and extended my invitation to him. Of course, he couldn't say no. Using 2 hunting tigers, which I withdrew from the Ruhr highway, we drove to a small rise east of the reservation. From there, we could enjoy magnificent observation of the enemy. Unfortunately, I noticed when opening fire that the Yanks were at least a good 3 kilometers from us after all. It thus took too long before our fire to sit well. In the meantime, the enemy tanks had crawled into a small patch of woods. Of course, they quickly asked for support against this superior force. It didn't take too long before the enemy put fire of a very unfriendly caliber onto our high ground. Actually, I didn't have any other business there, but as the gracious host, I wanted to allow the city commandant to experience at least a few impacting rounds up close. The danger of a direct hit was certainly slim because the Yanks were shooting with long-range artillery. The psychological effect of their salvos was greater than expected, however. Our Führer and grand strategist ran back into his bunker, leaving behind his walking stick. I kept both vehicles there and placed them in the cemetery south of the post to cover the east. The crews diligently camouflaged their vehicles, and I exhorted them to hurry up even more because a lame duck with an artillery observer in it was buzzing around in the air. In a real war, these things, which resembled our Fieseler Storch, would have been destroyed immediately. In a situation where we had neither aircraft nor flak, they could fly around without risk and direct the fire of their batteries with precision. Whenever our troops fired into the air with a machine gun, the Yanks immediately disappeared. I saw 2 or 3 planes shot down during the fighting in the Ruhr pocket, but they were purely lucky hits. In reality, any flying on the part of the enemy during the final weeks of the war was completely safe. The lame duck had discovered us, and soon there was a shot from the Yanks, which landed about 150 meters behind us. "Get in your vehicles as quickly as possible," I screamed out, but the young guys simply didn't listen. They just didn't have any experience and didn't believe there was any danger. The second round landed perhaps 80 meters in front of us. A fire for effect by the entire enemy battery followed immediately after that. A heavy round landed in the middle of our group. I was standing only a few meters from the impact, but miraculously received only a small piece of shrapnel. By then, of course, everybody who could still run had suddenly disappeared into the assault guns. 3 soldiers remained on the ground, however, and they cried out horribly. They had been severely hit. A piece of shrapnel had ripped open my loader's entire back and slightly damaged the vertebrae. I packed all 3 into my kubel and sent the driver directly to the hospital in Iserlohn, where I was well acquainted with the doctors. Despite the efforts of these men, one of the 3 wounded died shortly after admission. All of that was the sole consequence of insufficient training. When I got back to the headquarters and was about to descend the steps, I heard nearby machine gun fire. My Feldwebel and I investigated the matter immediately. Just inside the reservation boundary, we saw a soldier from an unknown unit. He was amazed to find German soldiers still there. He belonged to a scattered unit, which had broken through on its own initiative. They had run into an enemy reconnaissance patrol, during which the shooting that we had noticed had started. It should be noted that he said that none of the men had seen anything resembling an occupied line. That made me quite curious about the situation report of our commander. I went back to the bunker. We didn't have to worry about the Yanks advancing farther during the night anyway. I found the group in its customary composure and cheerful ambiance. I asked about the latest reports from the front. Full of pride, the city commandant briefed me. "Our fortress is holding like a ring of iron. Up to now, only the northern elements on the road to Cayman have had contact with the enemy." I answered with a little less swagger, but just as precisely. "If you don't immediately alert your reserve companies on the base, you will be captured before the Yanks even bother to call you on the phone." His answer was classic. "Don't get nervous just yet, my young friend." These were the types of men the Americans had to deal with. The man thought he needed to calm me down. I bid my sincerest farewells and intended to drive to my command post as fast as possible in my kubel. I wanted to pull both of my assault guns back from the connecting road to Cayman and to give orders to those on the Ruhr highway to immediately move out of Una in case the Yanks intended to overrun them. I drove along Federal Highway 233 to the north. About 50 meters before the intersection of that road with the Ruhr highway, I was taken aback. I stepped on the brakes. In front of us, vehicles were driving from east to west. We could only make out shadows and therefore sneaked closer on foot. Our suspicions were quickly confirmed. American wheeled and rubber-padded tracked vehicles were rolling quietly past Una toward Dortmund. They had absolutely no idea that there were still German soldiers around. Not a soul slowed them down in their enterprise. That's how firm the ring around Una was. My hunting tigers hadn't fired yet. They probably didn't want to reveal themselves. I raced back and fetched the Führer out of his bunker to show him the strange spectacle. We had just arrived back at the old position near the intersection when I heard the cannons of my assault guns fire. The traffic immediately broke up, and a few jeeps drove wildly back and forth in front of our eyes. I continued into the city by myself because my commandant preferred to walk back on foot. He was really afraid because I drove in one of the jeeps captured at Siegen. It had the Yank star displayed on it. Although my Feldwebel comforted him with the remark that the Americans would certainly take more offense at the uniform than the jeep, he didn't let himself be persuaded to make the return trip with us. My jeep had already performed good service for me a few times when I wanted to occupy the command posts directed to me by Corps and wasn't able to ascertain the presence of Americans until already at the location in question. After the wild shooting, the Yank vehicles pulled back to the eastern edge of the city during the morning hours. The Americans' fear had delayed the fall of Fortress Una once again. The bravery of the commandant and his garrison had little to do with it. Today I frequently wonder why we simply didn't allow ourselves to be snapped up. Everything had obviously been lost and the soldiers scarcely offered resistance anymore. But we didn't want to, nor could we believe that all our sacrifices had been in vain. If our opponents had at least shown a little pluck, we would have possibly capitulated more easily. At least then we would have been able to hope for fair treatment. No real combat soldier found it in his heart, however, to allow himself to be captured prematurely by these half-steppers, while at the same time our comrades on the Eastern Front were still bravely defending against the Russians. From Corps headquarters, I quickly drove back to Una to reach the city before the break of day. Just before the Ruhr highway, a red light was blinking. Could that be the Yanks? We still credited them with too much. We finally saw an SS man who was waving energetically with the flashlight. He said, "You can't drive into the city anymore. All the tank obstacles have been closed. Una will be defended to the last man." Saying, "Without me," I drove past the surprised young man. We soon reached the first tank obstacle. Any car could have easily driven around it off the road to the left or the right. I reached the military post without enemy contact. A straggler told me the good news that the commandant had departed. Before doing that, he had sent a radio transmission to the Führer's headquarters. Una encircled, holding out to the last man, "Long live the Führer." According to the latest order, the Una garrison was supposed to assemble in Iserlohn. I fetched my hunting tigers and led them south to the next village. We soon noticed that there was still a war on. An American tank became a nuisance. I quickly brought a hunting tiger into position on the eastern edge of the village and personally drove in the Kubel to a small patch of high ground to gain a vantage point. The enemy had already reached Federal Highway 233, and 5 tanks were right before our eyes under the trees. The distance was barely 600 meters. I quickly grabbed one of my assault guns to give the enemy something to think about. The commander of the hunting tiger, a Stabsfeldwebel without experience at the front, wanted to handle the matter himself. To be on the safe side, I first led him on foot to the high ground. I showed him the enemy and told him the distance, so nothing could really go wrong. It was like at the training area. The Stabsfeldwebel then went to his vehicle, and I remained to observe. The unfortunate man then made a fatal mistake. He didn't crank the cannon down to its right position until he had almost arrived on the high ground. Of course, the Americans heard the sound of the motor and reacted accordingly. 2 of the tanks scrammed, but the other 3 opened fire. The Stabsfeldwebel's vehicle was soon hit in the front and hadn't fired one shot itself. Instead of finally firing, the lunatic turned around on the high ground when he simply could have rolled backward. When the Yanks had the broadside of the hunting tiger in front of them, they let our vehicle have it. It immediately went up in flames. Other hits followed, and not one of the 6-man crew could save himself, probably because everyone got in each other's way. This example serves to prove that the best weapon and the greatest of enthusiasm are useless when thorough basic training has not been conducted. This concludes the 27th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.